We now go to the only gentleman on the dais who a TRIPS waiver could affect his current patents. Mr. Massie, the gentleman from Kentucky.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Shea, when I first heard the Biden administration announce they were going to suspend patents for vaccines, I was very taken aback because it's a right that's enshrined in the Constitution. But I've learned it's a little more complicated than that. It's not that he announced he would suspend patent protection in the United States to make use or sell something here in the United States. He suspended something called TRIPS. Can you explain to me what it is that was suspended that never got used? But is it a reciprocal enforcement mechanism? Is that what TRIPS is? Or is it reciprocal licensing agreements? What is TRIPS?
TRIPS was adopted in 1995 or went into force in 1995 at the time of the creation of the World Trade Organization. And it, as Mr. Gresser said, it establishes it requires WTO members with certain flexibilities for LDCs, least developed countries, and at one point for developing countries, to use their domestic mechanisms to establish a minimum set of intellectual property protections for patents, trademarks, trade secrets, and other matters. In TRIPS, there is a mechanism to obtain a compulsory license in extraordinary circumstances, but even to get a compulsory license, you have to engage the patent holder and potentially remunerate the patent holder. The TRIPS flexibility, the waiver of that requirement, which is what the ministerial decision of the WTO decided, waives that requirement. So an entity in WTO a member country can just utilize the patent without informing the patent holder or even without any kind of engagement with the patent holder.
Mr. Bush, when I first learned about this TRIPS thing where you can get compulsory licenses, I'm just troubled by TRIPS itself now that I know about this, because isn't this the logical conclusion of compulsory licenses, when instead of letting a free market decide what the price of a license should be, you let politicians decide what the price of a license should be? Isn't the logical conclusion that people who don't appreciate entrepreneurship are going to set the value at zero of a patent?
The compulsory licenses are generally coming in with a royalty fee of between 5% and 7%. So it's not quite zero, but it's not fantastic. The AIDS experience really drove successive decisions on what's known as TRIPS Article 31 bis. And that was the flexibility that allowed the members of the WTO to respond to a public health emergency. And the provisions there were centered on compulsory licensing, the expectation being that when times got tough, you could have generics providers, courtesy of their government, force a patent holder to hand over their idea at a royalty fee. And we really didn't see it during AIDS, and we aren't going to see it now. Even if it's never used, however, in expectation, the fact that we had 164 countries go along with the idea is going to devalue IP and seriously raise questions about how much protection is out there when things look tough. And so that really is what has to be worked out. Exceptions should always be narrowly construed and rarely used. We have to make sure that that goes for not just the part one of the TRIPS waiver, but whatever might come with a part two, if anything at all.
It sounds like eminent domain for property rights, but for patent rights. And in this case, with the waiver, the Biden administration said, just take it. Just take what you want here from these people who've developed it. Mr. Saddam, there's been a claim that there was no harm in this waiver since it didn't get used. Can you explain why there is harm and what the message that it sends to inventors and investors, that we can just take your idea and give it away? Yeah. Why is that harmful, even though it wasn't implemented?
Yeah, I think there was no direct harm in that it wasn't used, but what it adds, as I mentioned in my opening statement, was it adds uncertainty. And anytime there's uncertainty in a transaction, the likelihood of a transaction goes down. So just the threat of having someone at a time ill-defined in the future for an event that itself is ill-defined might mean that somebody can come in and take and use your IP without reasonable compensation for you, would lead people to say, well, maybe I just simply won't make this investment. In the area of a therapeutic, it might take $1.2, $1.3 billion of investment to create a drug to have in the first place that then someone can say, well, never mind, I'm just going to use those IP rights and make it and not pay you anything. So who on earth would invest that kind of money if they knew that they couldn't get the return that they need even just to break even later on? So it's a cooling effect and a headwind on even early stage research and directing things towards really, really hard problems that are going to be there in 5 or 10 years.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey.